Dustin, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. For people who aren't familiar with you and all the amazing work you're doing, especially around isometrics, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing stuff you have going on?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the podcast, Dan. So I guess I'll start by letting everyone know that I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada, originally, and like a lot of people you probably talk to, probably like yourself, do a lot of sports and things of that nature growing up. Um, so through that, I ended up at a private training facility and got along well. And that was kind of like one of my first regular jobs. First job I ever had was pushing carts around IKEA, basically, as a kid. But then when I got into the sort of performance space, that led me to pursue my first degree, and then, worked with some athletes, worked with some people, personal training, strength coach. And then that eventually led me to Southern Colorado, at Alamosa, Adams State for my master's. And then I got a real bug for the research and the teaching side of things. So then over the next several years, it was like, okay, I'll coach for a little bit and then I'll find my next like research opportunity, whether that was PhD or beyond. So just continuing the story, PhD in Auckland, New Zealand at AUT, back to Calgary for a little while where I did some more coaching, more in a clinical type of a setting, and then into my current role, which is at the University of Colorado's Anschutz Medical Campus, which is a little more clinical. And most of the stuff we do there is not on our main topic of today, but more clinical populations, ultrasound imaging, neuromuscular performance, and frailty. And then there's a little bit of a getting ahead. Soon in January, I'll start a assistant professor position at UCCS. So still staying in the University of Colorado system, but I'll move to Colorado Springs. And I kind of hope that that will allow for continuing on with the imaging and the clinical populations, but also allow me to work with students who might be interested in like isometric training or resistance training in general, regardless of populations.
Absolutely. No, you're doing a lot of amazing work, and it sounds like across the entire lifespan and population range, if you will. It's really impressive to see, and that's one of the things that I love about isometrics is I feel like they're easy to apply to anyone, whether it's the athlete or someone who is literally bedbound. Like there is a way to adapt an isometric exercise to meet them where they're at. But in this new trendy world of isometrics, I feel like there's new lingo coming out almost every week, from functional isometrics to ballistic isometrics to overcoming and yielding and EQIs. Like the list goes on and on and on. And I find a lot of times when it comes to isometrics, people almost get a little bogged down by the terminology at first because there's a lot of things that maybe they haven't heard before. But I think this is a space, at least during our conversation with Danny, we felt that simplicity wins at the end of the day. I'm curious, what's your overall framework when it comes to isometrics that way? How do you like to kind of break them down or organize them in your head, if you will?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about simplicity, with all the terminology, a lot of the focus of both myself and to a similar extent, Danny, is to break them down into sort of two primary categories. So I'm going to list off a bunch of words that kind of fit into them. So the first, the ones that I like to use, and I think Danny and a lot of the other people in the space are starting to lean towards, is pushing and holding isometrics, or pushing and holding tasks, might be another way. And if you look at the research or textbooks or programs that you might see online, you'll see the words like yielding and overcoming, as you mentioned. So yielding to us, that falls under the holding umbrella. You are preventing movement from gravity or a cable stack or something, but there's a degree of freedom in there. It can move you. You can move it if you don't produce enough force to match it. Whereas the pushing isometric, which is also called overcoming, or often functional isometric sometimes, is when you are pushing against something that cannot be moved. So that's, you put the leg extension machine on the very, very bottom and you try pushing it with one leg. Like maybe a world's strongest man competitor might be able to move it, but the vast majority of people, they're stuck in that position. or a strain gauge, or you load a deadlift bar to 800 pounds and you try and deadlift it, and you're not an 800-pound deadlifter.
Right, right. No, it's funny you say that because that's very similar to how Danny broke it down, and I think at the end of the day, a lot of the other subtypes of isometrics, if you will, kind of fit under those extensively that way. One of the papers that I feel like I always find myself citing of yours that way was, I think it was your 2019 article. You looked at, like, effects of muscle length, intensity, and intent, and all these other amazing things from an isometric standpoint. And I think that's probably one of the iconic papers that people think of when they hear isometrics. They think you, and they think one of those studies like that. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. As we kind of go through this world of isometrics, how much do you feel like those variables like joint angle and contraction time impact our success with isometrics? Because on one hand, I see people arguing that we have to have it down to the minute degree and we should be measuring. And I see other people arguing, you can just kind of ballpark it and you'll be fine.
Yeah. So that was the very first part or portion of my PhD. So that 2019, and it's probably unlikely that I'll ever have another paper outpace that as far as citations and stuff go. So that's really my number one thing, I suppose. So I'm quite happy that it's been read. Cited so much, both scientifically and in sort of the science education space and the science-based lifting type of space. It's pretty cool. But I would probably fall more into the less minute detail oriented kind of version of that. So again, it comes down to what is your general intent and your general intensity. And again, also, what is your general joint angle? Are you at a longish joint angle or a short one? Are you trying to pull as hard as you can, or are you submaximal to a large extent? But I kind of would think that whether you're going to failure at 40% or 30% is probably not going to make all that much difference. We might also see a big difference if your knee angle is 20 degrees versus 100 degrees, but not much between 190. I think then you're starting to get trivial changes, especially because in my mind, no program should be purely isometric. It should always be a supplement to whatever else you're doing, or to build into dynamics, or in certain joint problems or something like that. So at that point, everybody kind of improves from everything.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's interesting. I think when you look at, exclusively isometric programs, a lot of times I've seen them use isometric testing as the outcomes. And it's like, yeah, if you train isometrics, you get better at isometrics. That makes a lot of sense. I do think, to your point, they're definitely something that I like to include with other things. And I think, to your point as well, I tend to follow similar to you. I'm somewhat specific at times. Like, if I'm gonna put on a totally different hat and use isometrics to test strength, then yeah, I'll get a little bit more specific in the setup, a little bit more like measuring angles and that sort of thing. But for the most part, with the isometric training, and this is regardless of if we're talking overcoming or yielding, I usually just kind of eyeball the joint angle that I'm after. And it's like, look, if nothing else, we're getting good training adaptation. And we know that from the research that we're positively impacting soft tissue structures, neural structures, all those different things that way. You also mentioned intensity, and this is another one that I've seen highly debated, where some people, every time they train isometrics, they're putting a number to things. Hey, it always needs a force output. And other times, I tend to fall in the camp personally. I'm a little biased, but I don't put a lot of numbers to isometrics because I found when I was putting numbers to them, they vary so much with the training. It's like, hey, one day they're here, the next day they're here, and it's like a 10-15% difference one day to the next in what their ISO force output is, but they perceive it as the same level of intensity. So I tend to fall in the camp of maybe less is more from the numbers from both joint angles and intensities. Do you tend to follow something similar, or what do you typically recommend to the students and clinicians and coaches that you work with in relation to the intensity of their isometrics?
Yeah. Well, first, I guess thinking out loud is that when you're doing a maximal isometric, that is a more pure test of strength than a 1RM or even, how fast you're moving a barbell in a squat or something like that. And I think that would make sense why you and others might experience like 15% swings from day to day when generally you're not going to experience a 15% swing every time you test a 1RM back squat, even if you did that every single week. So that's a thought to maybe put away for another time. Um, yeah, I think if you have the ability to easily measure force, then you're probably not going to go too far astray by measuring it. But that is sort of something that is slowly getting better, but is still a big limitation to tracking force outputs isometrically in a weight room setting or a clinical setting. Again, there's more tools, force frames, strain gauges of all sorts. Um, I hope it becomes a product soon. I remember last year I peer reviewed a study where the researchers designed a tool that would go into any sort of pin select machine at any weight room, a leg extension, a pec fly, and it would lock it in place, and there would be a strain gauge attached to it. So you could literally do any exercise, any cable station in any gym that had pin selector. So I hope they're working on commercializing it. I've been meaning to actually reach out to those people. But yeah, I think unless you are quite advanced as a trainee, a perceived exertion, especially if you're doing, a few reps of a few seconds at a maximal exertion occasionally, you're probably going to see performance increases over time with some fluctuation, of course. So, like a lot of things, it depends on the population.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, playing with the range or the angle that you're using for isometrics and the intensity then impacts the neural adaptations to the performance adaptations and so on that way. And at least when I was talking with Danny, one of the things that continued to come up was, hey, look, I love the yielding isometrics for we're going to build a lot of muscle hypertrophy with those versus, hey, I'm going to use the overcoming isometrics to almost like potentiate, but also like if I want max force output. And, it's interesting to me because at least on the force plates, I've seen some people peak their force in 1 or 2 seconds and others take like 5 or 6 seconds. So I found at least from like the duration, depending on what my goal is with them, some of them I end up going a little longer from the duration side of their max effort ISO just because they don't hit that peak force as quick. And I think that the individual difference piece is something to take into account when prescribing overcoming ISOs, at least for the max effort side of things, is, adjust how long you're holding them if your whole goal is max force output, because some people are getting there in 2 seconds and others, it takes a little bit longer that way. Obviously, there's nearly endless adaptations to isometrics that way, from the tendinous structures to the neural side and so on that way. Which ones have you found really carry over the best to performance that way? And what is your kind of like sets, reps, EXRX, if you will, for those kind of like isometric to performance carryover optimization, if you will?
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll preface this by saying that unlike Danny and some other people like Alex Natara, I have been not all that much in the actual weight room for the last couple of years. So a lot of this time we've been talking about isometrics or even doing isometric research, a little bits here and there, more between my academic positions. So again, just want people to be a little bit aware of that. So most of the last few years, it's been me kind of experimenting on myself. Whereas those other guys have had, teams and elite athletes or clinical populations. Or I've talked to other people just so I have other anecdotal evidence that I can speak to. So for me, most of the time when I am doing isometric work, it's the holding or the yielding isometrics. And one of the things that I've used that for specifically for myself was a couple of years ago, I ended up injuring my hip. I'm not exactly how sure how it happened, but eventually, when it stuck around for a year, despite some efforts, I got an MRI, and there was like a lot of tendinopathies, a lot of issues in there that I won't get into because it was just a laundry list of things that showed up on the MRI. And through some experimentation, I did find that holding isometrics, especially at long muscle lengths, for pretty much all of the movements of the hip, internal rotation, external rotation, extension, and then eventually into closed joint movements like pistol squats, or single leg hack squats, skater squats. The holding isometrics, again, at least anecdotally, tended to reduce my pain, and I could kind of lower myself into a tough position where I had discomfort or, a quite substantial weakness, which for me was more of the middle range. I was okay at the bottom, fine at the top. But um, I found benefit to that. And again, I think anecdotally, a few times that I tried it, I would get like a Smith machine, lock into position, and then push against it. And that seemed to give me a lot more discomfort. So I just did not want to do that exercise. And I didn't do it long enough to figure out whether or not that would actually help me. Whereas the holds were less bothersome. And I think were a big part of getting me back to being able to do most of what I want.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that you bring that up, and it's interesting because I see something similar with the patellar tendon. Is there's this debate of do we do overcoming isos or yielding isos for patellar tendinopathy, and I think it's still a little bit mixed. Like on one hand, I've seen great results with overcoming isos, but on the other hand, I do see a lot of yielding iso type stuff there as well. So I think there's always some individual variability with all of these, and I think to your point, like it's so simple to do some type of holding isometric, right? And I think most people are already familiar with them, right? Like I think everyone knows what a wall sit is by this point. So it's like, hey, put yourself in a position, hang out there, don't let gravity win. So I think at the end of the day, it's so easy to access that type of training, if you will. And to a certain extent, I often wonder if some of the benefits that we attribute to some of these like stretch positions, for example, like, hey, I'm going to sink low into a lateral lunge and hold it to quote unquote stretch my adductors. I often wonder if the benefit is actually more due to the fact that we're just holding a position for a long period of time against gravity instead of it just being more of a muscle lengthening adaptation, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's so multifactorial and it takes a lot of effort to untangle. Again, could be ischemic, ischemia going in there, right? You're holding in this position, you're actually reducing the blood flow temporarily, then you release and some extra blood flow comes into play. And then there was maybe hormones and there's maybe other chemicals and there might be maybe it's just pure neural. We don't really know at this point. One thing to kind of like keep an eye out for early next year is Danny, myself, and a few other researchers, mostly from Singapore. We did compare pushing and holding isos in a training intervention, and looking at the quadricep muscles as well as patella tendon, which is what made me think of it. So that's basically in minor revisions, and those will be submitted within 1 to 3 months, kind of a thing. And just a little highlight is the differences were never statistically significant in any hypertrophy between the two, including patella tendon. But the tendon thickness did increase slightly more. Again, not enough to be statistically significant with the holding. So hypothetically, maybe a small amount more benefit on tendon adaptations morphologically from holding. And that would actually line up with a lot of the stuff that we've gone over in a review that we've pre-printed and is also in peer review.
That's fascinating. So essentially, a lot of the adaptations between overcoming and yielding are so similar that statistically we draw very few differences between them, with the exception of tendon thickness adaptations, if you will, in the patellar tendon, anyways.
Yeah, so again, it's larger samples, longer interventions, all these things where, in a perfect world, we'd have, 100 people and we train them for 6 months. And, but, research has its limitations there. But at least based on this study that I'm mentioning that will come out next year, um, yeah, the pushing was ever so slightly better. I'm using air quotes here because again, it never reached the threshold for statistical significance, but occasionally some of the effect sizes were at least something to pay attention to. The hypertrophy, all told, whether that was muscle hypertrophy or the patella tendon thickness, increased ever so slightly more across the board, regardless of which quadricep had in the pushing, or sorry, in the holding, whereas all of the strength measures improved slightly more in the pushing.
That's fascinating. When the new year comes around, that's going to be the first paper that I look to read that way. And obviously, as we're talking before, you were mentioning about the holding ISOs and how much that, helped you with your hip and so on that way. And it's funny because when I think holding ISOs, I tend to, correct or incorrect, bucket EQIs as almost like a subtype of a holding ISO, if you will. And I think that was another one that you did a number of papers on, is the EQI that way. And I think these are ones, they come up every now and then. I know we talked about them at length with Kyle Salmons, I'm pretty sure, on the podcast years ago. But in general, the EQI is one that I don't see applied as often as a base pushing or holding that way. For people who aren't familiar with the eccentric quasi ISO, or maybe they're just trying to understand the whole quasi ISO thing, like, is it an ISO? Is it not an ISO? Like, what is that quasi word that basically means apparently, but not really doing in front of it? What are the EQIs that way? And what have been kind of the main adaptations or applications that you've seen from them, from your research with them?
Yeah. So that was really the main focus of my PhD. And if anybody else is interested, so there's obviously my name they can look up, but then there's another researcher by the name of Zach Henderson, who did his PhD in the University of Manitoba and is now a faculty at, I think, Lakehead University in Canada. And he took a lot of these concepts and kind of built upon them, and he did a great job. I really think he really nailed his PhD papers, if I do say so. So, for anybody listening, the best way I think I can describe EQI would be holding an isometric. So, a holding isometric that we've discussed before, where you're resisting movement, but you are maintaining that hold for as long as you can, and as you might be able to visualize, you're going to eventually shift into an eccentric type of contraction where the weight is lowering, or you're lowering yourself from a chin up or something like that. But it's not voluntary, right? You were trying to hold your position as hard as you can, but eventually there's just too much fatigue, too much weight, whatever, and it's going to pull you through that full range of motion, or at least until, you let go of the pull up bar, or you have a stop on a machine, or a squat rack or something like that. So again, kind of visualize in your head, you go up, you lower yourself for a pull up until the bar is at like eye level, and you're just holding and holding and holding. And then you're fighting the resistance all the way until the rep ends. And the whole thought around that, I suppose, is that you get the benefits of the holding isometric, but then you might also get the benefits that are at least partially unique to eccentric training.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You broke that down really well. And it's interesting because that's something that I've heard from a bunch of individuals in the space as well, is chasing that eccentric strength gain moment and developing, some people call it like an eccentric strength deficit, if you will, like making sure that the eccentric is notably stronger than the concentric, especially in athlete populations where having the ability to decelerate and produce braking type forces rapidly is very essential, but also being able to produce them for a long time, resistant to fatigue. And that's a place that I've seen a lot of benefit from the EQIs. And I know that anyone listening that's rehabbed with an ACL with me, is probably having horror stories hearing me talk about them right now, because we loved the EQI leg extension in particular. Something about that long, drawn out eccentric with a very isolated quad moment was doing wonders for bringing quadricep strength back in populations where the quads are often inhibited for one reason or another that way. And we did other types of isometrics as well. We did overcoming early on. We progressed to yielding. We kept some overcoming in. And then eventually we swapped the yielding for the EQIs, and the quads were just going bananas with the EQI loading that way. And it's interesting because I've seen a few different papers talk about the loading behind the EQI, but in general, I usually look to keep it about 40-45 seconds. I've seen some people go longer to the point where they're doing multiple minutes, which, to that point, I mean, one, props to you for doing that long of an EQI, but two, I also have to wonder, like, from a loading standpoint, like, I think if we're able to do like a long drawn out EQI for minutes? Are we adding enough load to cause that like we're still causing adaptation, but maybe we could, I don't know, throw a little bit more load in there. Maybe that's just my load bias talking, but it's always fascinating to see me to see how people apply the EQIs clinically that way.
Yeah, well, and I think with the really long ones, you're most people you're gonna run into issues with, like, motivation and just mental toughness, I suppose. Even myself, if I ever program EQIs for, any number of reasons. So, like I'm almost 36. I had my time where I lifted as heavy as I could, and I still do in some exercises, but I'm a little more cautious. Now I'm like, oh, okay, what's the record on the board at the gym for pull-up reps or push-up reps or something like that. So if I'm trying to build up to pull-up reps, I might throw in one single, maximal EQI on my last set of pull-ups or something like that early on. And then I might do the same with loaded rep weight when I'm doing some loaded stuff later on in a program or something like that. But I know, like, if I'm doing a 2-minute EQI or something like that, I really don't want to do a second one, and I probably don't even want to do one the next week. So you start kind of running into issues with the human side of things with really long ones.
Absolutely, and kinda mentioning that potential eccentric carryover, how did you find the EQIs compared to eccentric training in terms of things like, the athlete's soreness level and that sort of thing?
Yeah, so the EQI, based on the studies, or at least a couple of the studies that I was leading, uh, generally is going to result in less muscle soreness and less swelling and less fatigue, or at least quicker recovering fatigue than doing overloaded eccentrics. And that's probably for, a bunch of factors. If you're doing overload eccentrics, just your weight is going to be heavier. So whether that's going to be, neurological fatigue or micro trauma or what have you, um, again, the recovery is a little bit faster with EQI. And I think that helps it to kind of slot in with sort of this intermediate portion between isometrics and eccentric loading. Because if you're going to do the hierarchy, I think, in terms of how much total loading you can actually perform is going to be, ignoring pushing isometrics for now, is going to be holding isometrics, EQI, and then sort of traditional eccentric loading where you're going up with two legs and down with one, or you have a training partner help you with a leg press or something like that. So I think that's kind of the continuum that I visualize. And to go back to my hypothetical, or my own hip, once I got okay at holding isometric skater squats, then I would start doing some isometrics on single leg hack squat. And then when I got okay at that, then I would have a training partner help me do eccentric single leg hack squats. And now I can just hack squat. But that felt good to me as a single person kind of study or observation.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot, and one of the things, as you mentioned about the EQI versus the overload eccentric that my mind initially went to is just putting on my, like, clinic partnership guy hat for a second. Like, when we had the clinic space, like, we were trying to be efficient from, like, hey, stuff that we need to get athletes better, but also, like, budgets exist, unfortunately, and we can't buy, like, weight releasers for 12 power racks. We can't buy, like, there's a limit, and I found like the EQIs were giving that eccentric type benefit that we wanted while saving some of the time and saving some of the equipment expense that way, if you will. Now, I think there's a lot of advancements that are coming out. Like I have one of the Voltra units that way, and they have a eccentric overload mode that makes it easy. But it's like, until I get the point where I can put one of those on each side of the barbell times amount of racks in the gym, unfortunately, I just didn't think it was feasible to be doing overload eccentrics like that. And again, like you mentioned, if you have machines and partner, like that's the ultimate hack right there. Like I still think manual resistance is often overlooked and often goaded for a lot of these different things that way. So you can't sleep on that stuff at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, and even, like, the training partner stuff too is like, I go to a gym where, and I'm a fairly outgoing guy. I'm not too shy, so I make friends pretty easily. But, if you're somebody who works, out at home or, maybe doesn't just wants to train, then yeah, you kinda run out of, some options. So being able to just alter the tempo or the pacing of something might be mentally the easiest thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious. I know a lot of your research has revolved around the EQI, and obviously we've talked about the overcoming ISO, the yielding ISO at length thus far, pushing and holding, I should say that way. One of the ones that's continued to fascinate me, and I see these popping up more and more, is this functional isometric or isometronic or dynamic. Everyone's got a different word for it nowadays, but essentially a heavy partial rep, usually with a barbell, followed by a max effort push or pull for a short duration, like 5, 10 seconds. And I've seen some stuff coming out suggesting, hey, maybe these are really good for motor unit recruitment, but also like you've got effects of a pushing isometric while you're also holding a maximal load, while you've also dynamically repped that maximal load. And I think there's just a lot of different variables and factors that go into whether or not you can be successful with these or not. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these functional isometrics, isometronics, whatever you want to call them, if you will, that way. Because, like I said, I feel like there's some benefit to them, and I've been playing around with them in my own training. But at the same time, I just feel like there's so many variables and factors in play that it's kind of hard to control them.
Yeah, I think that's probably the main reason I've mostly stayed away from that stuff myself for a long time. I had a handful of interesting mentors that I trained with, or when I was, when my dream was to be a strength coach and not a professor, and play around with a lot of these things a lot more. So I don't think I can really give you any real good insight other than the fact that, yeah, when you add these maximal pushing efforts, especially isometrically, for 5 seconds even, right? You can simply build up to a lot more force output at a single position than you can with anything dynamic. So even the most grindy bench press is not going to have the same amount of force as a maximal pushing isometric with a barbell into, the squat rack or whatever else. Because again, the grindiest bench in the world is going to last about 10 seconds, maybe. And, you're going to be at one particular joint angle for like a second, maybe two at the sticking point, and then you're grinding through the rest of the rep. So that motor unit recruitment in that specific position, you really don't have any other option if you want to get the absolute most activation from that angle than to do a pushing isometric. Um, but I'm not sure I could give you any more insight than that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I like the way you broke that down. Now, earlier, obviously, you mentioned about how in the future a lot of your research works are shifting towards that clinical population side of things that way. And I see a lot of potential applications for isometrics in that space as well. I'd love to hear more about kind of where you see the future going in the clinical work, if you will, and if you see any unique potential applications for isometrics in that space, if you will.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple things that need to be, I guess, just defined. So clinical would be having to do with either like injury, disease, uh, some sort of thing like that. I don't necessarily just mean like, okay, once you're 70, you're a clinical population, because that really shouldn't be the case. And then there are also going to be clinical athletic populations too, right? So somebody who's had a torn hamstring or they've ruptured an Achilles tendon or something like that. So, I guess there's a couple different subsections of what I mean when I think of clinical, especially regarding this type of research. So, one thing that I would love to look at in the near future, and I do have plans to do this, although it is not yet in the works. That might be one of the more early projects that I start with my new position, is to look at the sort of fascial kinematics between these pushing and holding isometrics. Because we know neuromuscularly, there's a lot of stuff that's been done there before with EMG or even EEG with the brains. But we're not exactly sure what happens in the muscle and with the muscle tendon unit between these two types of isometrics, and if that varies based on intensity. So, using sort of live recording of ultrasound probe, and then having ramping, pushing, and ramping, holding contractions at different intensities, and then looking at the difference and how those all sort of interact is something I'd love to look at. And how that leads into the clinical side of things would be, for example, hamstring pulls with sprinting. And there's a little bit of debate about what exactly causes hamstring injuries during sprinting. Is it a lack of isometric strength? Is it a lack of eccentric strength? Is it, something else entirely? And being able to figure out these types of things might lead to pushing or holding isometrics being a better sort of predictor or a better tracker throughout a season, so that we can try and mitigate injury risk as best as possible, and perhaps better evaluate whether somebody is ready to come back and sprint at high velocities again.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely incredible, and to that point, on the soft tissue injury side of things, at least from the physical therapy side of things that way, anytime I've had athletes come to me with soft tissue injuries, and the hamstring and the adductor group are probably two of the most common that we see, maybe like a quad in like the soccer population as well, but like in general, that thigh region just pops up so much in sports. Like I typically start them very early on with low level isometrics, like whatever they can do pain free, just to get something going from a training standpoint, if you will. But to your point, getting into like more of a microscopic level, if you will, and looking at what occurs at the fascicle level, because I think there's some research out there, don't quote me on this, that isometrics can essentially cause some type of reorientation effect of the fascicles despite no movement occurring. So yeah, in a perfect world, isometric is motionless. However, we're getting some type of reorganization type of effect going on despite this no movement or lack of movement.
Yeah, well, and this comes down to the fact that, tendons are, even if they shouldn't stretch much, they should stretch a little bit.
Right.
So, your still or your static movement is really along the muscle tendon unit, not just the muscle itself. There's muscle that will shorten at least a little bit, and the tendon lengthen, so you get no joint movement. Um, but yeah, so I think again, it's not just me, but there's a lot of other people looking at this, including pretty much everybody on the systematic review that is pre-printed that I mentioned, is looking at
Coming
these types
soon.
of things.
Yeah.
Yes. We have two people in Germany, Laura Schaefer and Frank Bittman, although I believe Frank is either retired or almost retired. Um, and then myself, Danny, Andre, and Alex. Um, so yeah, I know Laura's really into using holding and pushing isometrics as more of an evaluation tool, whereas Danny and Alex are more about using it to create adaptations specifically in athletes. I'm kind of like in between, but also in this clinical area, and I think Andre is kind of more or less like me as well. And then there's other researchers. Again, there's I mentioned Zach before, but then there's also a PhD student in Italy by the name of Giuseppe. So I'm sure his stuff will pop up for you at some point, and hopefully he might be another person you could talk to in the future.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
just to kind of keep things rolling with the clinical stuff. So with either people who are potentially bedbound, um, there seems to also be some evidence that like light in just flexing a muscle in a hospital bed can help to mitigate muscle loss, for example. Or you might think a bit like co-contraction training, which you might visualize as like a bodybuilder posing, right? They're flexing their muscles, they're flexing their bicep and their tricep at the same time. So there's no joint movement, but both of those muscles are getting decent activation. There's also evidence around that, at least in untrained populations, that can actually lead to some degree of muscle growth. So somebody is completely sedentary can just flex their quads for, you know, 5 sets, 5 reps for 10 seconds a rep or something like that. I'm guessing here about the programs and the studies, but they can grow muscle in that way. So a clinical population, somebody who's just been in a hospital for any number of reasons, maybe that's where you can actually start before you go to sort of traditional physical therapy.
Yeah, no, I love that, and I could not agree more. I always talk about isometrics as the lowest hanging fruit when we get into the clinical side of things, and it doesn't matter what population we're talking about, whether that's the MSK ortho injury in the athlete or maybe more of a geriatric type of disablement or pathology that way, if you will, whatever it is. I always look at this as the lowest hanging fruit because anecdotally, when I'm having conversations with people, they tell me about all the things that they can't do because of injury or pathology. And then I go, okay, can you not move? Can you just tense this muscle? And they're like, oh, yeah, yeah, I can do that. I was like, perfect. We're going all in on that. And even just in the populations with lower back pain, right? Disc pathologies, which I think, majority of Americans can relate to some kind of lower back pain, if you will. I've had athletes that I've worked with, again, anecdotally, but they are fearful of the deadlift. They don't wanna bend over. They don't wanna reach up, pick anything up, and, like, even just an empty barbell to them, don't wanna touch it. And then just out of curiosity, I'd throw them on the force plates for, iso mid-thigh pull, and they're pulling 300-400 pounds of force comfortably with no pain. So it's like, hey, like, to your point, this is a great way to keep that neural connection, alive and well that way. Because I think that old adage, "If you don't use it, you lose it," in relation to neuromuscular adaptations holds true. And I'd rather get some kind of training stimulus, even if it's, quote unquote, just isometric and not like your heavy loaded eccentrics or whatever that way. I'd rather get that than not get anything at all. And I think we could probably just do a whole podcast at some point going over all the different adaptations clinically because like even the post-op population, it's like, okay, well, you had a knee replacement. Can you do shoulder isometrics? Can you do elbow isometrics? Anything that we can do to get more exercise type adaptations in people, because I think when we look at the general health status of a lot of the country, it's not where we want it to be. So anything we can do to encourage positive exercise adaptation, for me, I'm willing to make that transaction every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we don't need to get into public health or, you know, aging societies or anything like that in any kind of detail. But yeah, we need to for that type of, low physical ability people, anything is better than nothing. And really need to make it accessible because eventually and probably sooner than a lot of people realize we're going to have a lot of people who are very old and not that many, relatively speaking, we're not going to have that many trainers and physical therapists and all that. So, the efforts need to be really efficient in how we kind of divvy up work and exercise and make it available to everybody no matter where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more, Dustin. And obviously, I feel like you and I can probably talk about isometrics all day long. I always get so fired up when I get to talk isometrics with people. It's just like, this is great. It always makes my day. But is there anything that we missed as we were chatting or anything else you want to discuss that way?
I mean, I guess still at the end of the day, I've talked about isometrics a few times on podcasts, and I think, people can benefit from them in a wide variety of populations and contexts and all that kind of stuff. But, for the most part, I think for the vast majority of people, it's like exercise, go to the gym, lift heavy weights if you can, get guidance. There's nothing necessarily magical about any of this stuff, but it's always kind of fun to think about. And I think there are contexts for a couple weeks at a time, or even one or two act workouts at a time, where they might be the best tool for the job. So again, more research, more anecdotes, more discussions, I think is always welcome.
Oh, yeah. Always looking for more. And as you mentioned before as well, not saying that like isometrics are the end all be all. Like, I still think athletes need to sprint, for example, or like Danny and I talked about like iso plyo supersets at length. And there was a lot of positive things to come from his work around that. And I think that's something that, people can always look for as well is like, this could fit in with any one of a million different places in your programming. It's just a matter of how do you understand the tools and how do you apply them to your population? And that's the magic in it, if anything, how you apply it. So, Dustin, for people who want to find out more about you, keep up to date with your clinical and research work and so on that way, where can they find you at, man?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like technically on most of the social media platforms. Most of what I do on X or Twitter is repost some studies, and then when my own come out, then I'll post them there. But probably ResearchGate, honestly, if you're looking for the actual PDFs of the studies as well as like the preprints, anything like that. ResearchGate is the go-to. Almost everything I've done is up there. There's only like one or two journals that have ever asked me to take something down, which I did because I agreed to that when I published with them. But the vast majority have never ever contacted me about, take a PDF down. So that'll be the easiest place to actually see the research and read the full studies if that's what they're after. And yeah, s Twitter or X, I would take DMs and, maybe you'll post I can probably give you one of my email addresses at the end of this if you wanna post that as well.
Yeah, email, or I'm sure you have a booming TikTok presence or something like that. Not quite.
It's one of the only ones I'm not on.
It's probably for the better. Um, Most people I talk to are like, "Yeah, I spend way too much time on that thing." But yeah, we'll link to, all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything that Dustin is up to. Dude, this was awesome. Appreciate your time and your insights.
Cool. Well, thanks, Dan, and like I said, I think there'll be some really good stuff in the next couple of years between, myself and Danny and Giuseppe and whomever else.